Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid, what he's talking about can't be serious, and when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, I can't forgive you. Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on, and then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm, and then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. There is exactly one YouTube channel that I personally religiously follow. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's like the most epic storytelling. And my goodness, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you will be a fan of Bedtime Stories. They cover strange, crazy stories as well, and it's just masterfully done. But I'm not here today just to tell you how great Bedtime Stories is. I'm here today because I have an announcement. Bedtime Stories is starting a podcast, and it's going to fall under the Ballen Studios banner. We're working together. It's super cool. But here's the even bigger news. Not only is Bedtime Stories a brand new Ballen Studios podcast, it is live right now. New episodes of the Bedtime Stories podcast will air each week on Wednesday, but right now the first 3 episodes of the podcast are available wherever you get your podcasts. So go and mule kick the Bedtime Stories follow button right in the solar plexus and get hooked on them just like I did. But first, check out this clip from the trailer for Bedtime Stories.
Turn off the lights, get into bed, and turn up the volume. It's time for a creepy bedtime story. From MrBallen Studios, welcome to Bedtime Stories, a new weekly show that will truly immerse you in a strange, dark and mysterious world and haunt your dreams. We'll bring you true stories from around the world, from the paranormal to the supernatural, unsolved mysteries, strange deaths, cryptids, and the most disturbing of true crime, all told in a unique and bone-chilling way. New episodes every Wednesday. Follow Bedtime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. Bedtime Stories.
On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him. And as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything. And he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that. But a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on, and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay?" And at first Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, you snubbed me in the lunch line. And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning, during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up, and Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird." Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Jian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Jian must be. But Jian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Jian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Jian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Jian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Jian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Jian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak. And then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Jian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Jian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Jian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Jian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed. And here we are, he has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Jian. So they wheeled Jian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Jian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Jian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Jian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Jian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles. But it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Jian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Jian's esophagus, But we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Jian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Jian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Jian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Jian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Jian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Jian ever tried Sanakji again. At 4 a.m. on a winter day in 1993, a 50-year-old man named Joe walked down a dark hallway inside of his farmhouse in Kentucky. As he moved, he did his best to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake up his wife or son, who were sleeping nearby. But when Joe got about halfway down the hall, he happened to look inside the family room, and he thought he saw something moving. He strained his eyes to see who it was, thinking maybe it was his wife or son who had gotten up for some reason, but he just couldn't tell. However, as Joe stared into the darkness, he heard the sound of floorboards creaking inside the family room, and then before Joe could do anything, the thing he had seen moving was now rushing straight towards him. Hours later, Kentucky State Police would arrive at Joe's house, and what they would discover there was a monstrous crime that literally had never been committed before in this part of Kentucky. On June 14, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of three had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death, and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, "I think I have Lyme disease," they said, "Yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you." And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, with these bee stings, I'm gonna have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's gonna take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease. I am so excited to announce that we here at Ballen Studios have a brand new show that is live right now for free on all podcast platforms. It's called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, and as you might have guessed, it's about medical mysteries. Take, for example, the very first episode of the show called Ashes to Ashes. It's about this adult son who goes to check on his father who lives in the woods by himself. And when he gets to his dad's house, he goes inside and the power's off and there's this weird gooey substance on everything, the furniture, the walls, food everywhere. And the son, he calls out for his dad. He can't see his dad doesn't call back. And so the son leaves and gets help. And when help arrives, they search his father's house and they find something in the very back of the house that is far more bizarre and shocking than the gooey substance on the walls. Their discovery would quickly become one of the most talked about medical mysteries of all time. Again, this story is called Ashes to Ashes. It's episode number 1 on MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, which is a podcast that is new and free and available everywhere. New episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries will come out every Tuesday, but if you have no patience and you just want to listen to a whole bunch of episodes right now, now, you can listen to 8 episodes of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music. Again, the show is called Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, and it's available right now everywhere for free. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016, 13-year-old Shoaib Ahmed and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased a soccer ball across the dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line drive shot right at the net, but at the last second the goalie jumped and blocked the shot. And so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation, but even though he was frustrated he missed a shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother, Shoaib, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shoaib was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand, and the two brothers, without a word to their friends who were just kind of standing there watching, they took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shoaib, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw locking up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed, with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shoaib off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up. And then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him. And then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shoaib and Abdul lived. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences, and they had heard about the boy's nightly bizarre collapses, and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shoaib still in their beds in a semi-comatose state, unable to move, but it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside, goofing around and playing, acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shoaib as the solar boys because they were only normal and active and like the other kids during the daylight hours when the sun was up, and then at night they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now, the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a grift to get people to donate money to the family. But Shoaib and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientists would talk to Abdul and Shoaib's father first, and he would explain to them that really since Abdul and Shoaib were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so with the family's permission, these scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shoaib and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also, the scientists tested Abdul and Shoaib's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shoaib slowly lost control of their bodies and became paralyzed and mute. And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. Then, the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up, and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shoaib were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around, no problem. And so to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this. Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal and they had passed all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shoaib should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't. And these scientists didn't know why. Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the Solar Kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shoaib had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed. And so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water. But that didn't work, and so the family was close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons. But then in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, a TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about this strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the vice chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, it was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys, but they were very convinced that this was a real condition. And so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them, and he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shoaib, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad, and that night Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Akram gave each of the boys a pill. And 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mute and laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg. And then Shoaib, right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shoaib. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shoaib was just a dopamine pill, and what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too, and so Abdul and Shoaib, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night. On the evening of July 3rd, 1992, 35-year-old George Decker was cooking in the kitchen inside of the apartment that he shared with his girlfriend in Jasper, Indiana. And as George cooked, he began to cough. At first, George thought it was just a little tickle in his throat that would go away, but as he continued to cough, this feeling, this sensation in his throat that was making him cough was only getting worse and worse. And this cough was not a normal cough. It was a deep, guttural, kind of rough-sounding cough that really hurt as he did it, and it kind of scared George, like he had never heard himself make this sound before. And in the other room, George's girlfriend, Juanita, she heard this very odd-sounding cough, and so she came out into the kitchen to see what was going on. And when she got there, she found George leaning on the counter, barely able to catch his breath because he was coughing so much. And this was totally out of character for George. He wasn't sick. He didn't have some sort of respiratory problem. He didn't smoke cigarettes. He did work in a metal shop where he melted down aluminum and poured it into different molds, but he always followed all the safety precautions. He wore a mask. He did all the things you're supposed to do to make sure he didn't inhale anything toxic. And so there was really no good reason why George would suddenly be having this unbelievable coughing fit. And so as Juanita kept asking George, hey, are you okay? Can I do anything? George, he can't even talk. He just pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and he put it over his mouth as he continued to cough. And then when he pulled the handkerchief away, it was clearly covered in blood. Now, George was quick to kind of put the handkerchief back in his pocket, not wanting to deal with the fact that he was coughing up blood. But Juanita, she saw the blood and said, okay, George, I don't know what's going on, but you are going to the hospital right now. Now, George, even though he couldn't talk because he was coughing so much, clearly did not want to go. And he kind of resisted Juanita pretty aggressively. He did not want to go. But Juanita finally grabbed him and literally dragged him through the house, out the front door, and down into their car. And then just a few moments later, they were on their way to the hospital located a few miles away. By the time they actually parked in front of the emergency room at this hospital, George's cough had actually died down a little bit. And so now George was being really insistent that it was totally pointless to go to the hospital, that they did not need to be here. Take me back home. This is ridiculous. But Juanita really pressed him and said, you can't goof around with coughing up blood. You have to go in there. And so finally, George, who was totally annoyed by this, relented. He got out of the car and the two of them walked to the hospital. And then when they went in the front doors of this emergency room, a nurse came up to greet them and see what was going on. And George kind of inexplicably pushed the nurse, like, to get away from me. I don't need your help. And Juanita, she was so embarrassed and tried to apologize, and the staff just kind of rolled with it and just kind of gave him his space. And then for the rest of the time they were there, the staff basically only talked to Juanita, while George sat in the corner with his arms crossed, unwilling to talk or give them any information. Toward the end of this hospital visit, the doctor would prescribe George some antibiotics for what he called an upper respiratory infection, and then the doctor asked George if he was willing to stay the night so they could observe him and make sure he really was okay. But George flatly refused. He got up, turned around, and practically ran out of the hospital. And Juanita said, "I'm so sorry," and she followed after him. Over the next couple of days, George would take these antibiotics that he was prescribed, but they really did not make a difference. He continued to have these huge coughing fits, and even worse than that, something Juanita noticed was George's skin was clearly turning blue, in particular on his arms, his hands, his fingertips, and on his face. And so finally, about a week after that first visit to the ER, Juanita, she looked at George and just felt like he looks so bad. He has to go back. They have to check him again. And so Juanita was able to, again, convince George to go to the hospital. He was very resistant to the idea, but now he was so physically weakened and drained from whatever was going on, he just kind of went with whatever Juanita wanted. And this time, when they went to the hospital, they would give George a chest x-ray, and it would reveal George had pneumonia in both of his lungs. This explained why he was coughing so much, and it also explained why his skin was turning blue. Because of this infection in his lungs, his body was not getting enough oxygen, and when that happens, it leads to a condition known as cyanosis, which turns your skin blue. But when doctors tried to figure out what was actually causing George's pneumonia, they immediately ran into a brick wall. Usually, pneumonia is caused by bacteria, viruses, or some other microscopic invader, and doctors can test a patient's mucus to determine which one it is. But when they tested George's mucus, they couldn't find any evidence of anything that would cause pneumonia. The doctors also ruled out aluminum pollution because he did work in a metal plant and could have been inhaling the aluminum when he melted it down, but he was negative for that. And then also doctors began looking into all these crazy other possibilities like strange fungus that maybe George had come in contact with that caused this, or, very rare viruses and bacteria. But no matter what the doctors thought of, when they tested George, it would come back negative. And so, with the exception of his x-ray that clearly showed he had pneumonia, every other test they ran on George made it seem like he was a healthy guy. And so George would spend weeks in the hospital with doctors and nurses constantly trying to figure out what was wrong with him, but not succeeding. And as each day went by, George's condition got worse and worse until finally he was put on a ventilator because his lungs actually just didn't work on their own. And so a ventilator basically forces air into the patient's body. But no matter how much oxygen they pumped into George's body, he continued to have these terrible coughing fits and his skin stayed blue. Finally, in October, so 3 months after George had first developed this coughing fit, he would pass away. George's doctors were totally baffled. It did not make sense what had happened to George. He was young and healthy, and then something that was totally powerful and aggressive had wiped him out. And so the doctors knew they needed to figure out what that thing was and how to cure it before other people died from the same mystery illness. On October 8th, so 5 days after George passed away, an Indiana pathologist named Dr. Daniel C. Weaver, who was known for his ability to figure out unexplained deaths like George's, was called to the hospital where George died to perform George's autopsy. And when Dr. Weaver began the autopsy and looked inside of George, he could not believe how just absolutely ruined George's lungs were. Healthy lungs are sort of like cotton candy. The tissue is light and airy, which is perfect for transferring the oxygen we breathe throughout our bodies. But George's lungs were thick and heavy, and they were lumpy with scar tissue. They were totally useless. And so Dr. Weaver knew, George basically suffocated to death. But now the question was, why? Dr. Weaver would run into the same obstacles as all the other doctors when he attempted to find contamination inside of George's lungs. There was nothing to see. In fact, at the end of the autopsy, Dr. Weaver had basically learned nothing as to why this happened to George. In frustration, after this autopsy was over, Dr. Weaver went to George's medical records and just began reading through them, and it was at this point that he saw something very odd that other doctors clearly had seen too, but they must have thought it was not important. At that very first ER visit, Juanita had told nurses and doctors that George, before he had begun coughing in the kitchen, he had been in a great mood. And generally speaking, George was just a very positive and upbeat person. But she said once he started coughing, it was like he transformed into somebody else and became mean and nasty. And Juanita had to practically drag him to the hospital. And then also there was a note in the file about how George had walked through the doors and pushed that admissions nurse. And so Dr. Weaver thought to himself, maybe George's belligerence was not just him being a jerk, but maybe he had ingested something toxic that was affecting obviously his lungs and also his brain, and that was causing him to behave this way. And so Dr. Weaver called the manager of the metal shop where George had worked to try to ask him if there were other chemicals or toxins inside of the plant that maybe George had been exposed to. But the manager just did not want to talk about any of that. Instead, he just wanted to talk about basically how awful George was as a person. The manager clearly did not like George, and he began talking about how George was obsessed with making money at all costs, and that in addition to working in the metal plant, George had all these kind of sketchy, kind of borderline illegal side jobs to make more money. And then at some point, the manager just began talking about this one particular potential scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of silver and gold. And the doctor at this point is not really even listening. He just wants to get off the phone with this guy because it's obvious the manager is not really trying to help. He's just trying to bash George. But at some point, the manager, in detailing this gold and silver scam, mentioned something that piqued the doctor's interest. And suddenly the doctor was really intently listening to this manager and actually began taking notes and asking clarifying questions about this particular scam that George was apparently involved in. And then when Dr. Weaver hung up the phone with this manager, he felt pretty confident that he had actually figured out what had happened to George. The clues had all been there the whole time. George's blue skin and his rude and violent behavior at the ER, but nobody had put them together correctly because the cause of what was happening to George was so weird, no one would have ever thought of it on their own. On the night that George first began coughing in the kitchen, he was not cooking dinner like everybody assumed. He was actually cooking teeth, like human teeth. The metal shop manager told Dr. Weaver on the phone about the scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of gold and silver. And the manager explained to Dr. Weaver that George was going to all of these local dentist offices and he was collecting all of their discarded teeth. What George wanted was teeth that had fillings in them because some of the fillings, especially for older patients, were made from gold and silver. George would then literally cook the teeth until he was able to extract the gold and silver. Now, if he had just been cooking teeth with gold fillings, he'd probably still be alive. But because George also was cooking the teeth with silver in them, during that process of cooking the silver teeth, mercury gas was released and George would inhale the gas. And mercury gas is deadly. And so the gas went into George, it ravaged his lungs, and it also created these massive mood swings and mental disturbances, which explained why he became so nasty and mean when he got to the ER. Also, ingesting high levels of silver, which George was doing as well, can turn your skin blue. So in the end, George did not die from pneumonia, he died from mercury poisoning.